Week 11. Overview. Jacksonian Democracy. The election of Andrew Jackson in 1828 marked a real turning point in American political history. So much so that his 8 years in office and the 3 presidents who followed him make up an era called the Age of Jackson. During his years as president, Jackson strengthened the power of both the presidency and the common man. A strong individual with common roots, he was born to Scots-Irish immigrants in a log cabin, and a lackluster education, Jackson personified the self-made man of his era. Andrew Jackson was considered the people's man. Many were attracted to Jackson because he, like most of them, had grown up as a common man. He had been born in a log cabin in the backwoods of South Carolina. He was only 13 when he joined the mounted militia in 1780 during the Revolutionary War after British troops invaded his home state. Jackson worked his way through life to achieve success. As a young man, he became a successful lawyer and landowner, and then later an Indian fighter and a general in the War of 1812. He was seen as a military hero for his bravery in fighting for the United States against the Indians and the British at New Orleans, and the people loved him for that reason. Jackson's soldiers called him Old Hickory for his physical courage and toughness on the battlefield. 62 years old and in poor health when he took office, Jackson was tough, but typically fair. As we learned last week, Jackson lost his first bid for president in 1824. He was not a man to forgive or forget the corrupt bargain that he believed John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay had entered into against him. Together with other supporters, Jackson and Martin Van Buren built a new political party, the Democrats. Jackson was for the common man and laborers, and against bankers and elite politicians in power. 4 years after he lost to John Quincy Adams, Jackson won a sweeping victory in the election of 1828. The common people had triumphed. The subsequent Inauguration Day party at the White House was chaotic and out of control. There were not only politicians and wealthy families in attendance, but also many common people who wanted to celebrate the success of their president. Jackson opened his home to all, but the crowd went a little wild. They pinned Jackson against a wall. He escaped the mansion through a window. He had to spend his first night as president in a nearby hotel. During his 2 terms in office, Jackson vetoed more bills than all his predecessors put together. While earlier presidents had been willing to let Congress set the direction for the internal governance of the nation, Jackson felt the president should actively set the course for all domestic policies. His example strengthened and changed the role of the presidency in America. At the same time that he took much power into his own hands, he was fiercely nationalistic. Jackson would allow no threats to the Union, and when his own vice president, John C. Calhoun, proposed that his home state of South Carolina nullify a federal tax, Jackson threatened to enforce unity militarily. Jacksonian democracy is a term that sums up the rise of political power for the individual, common man in America. Before Jackson's time, voting had been a privilege reserved for the wealthy, since age and property restrictions limited both the number and type of voters. During Jackson's era, voting restrictions in the new western states were relaxed such that younger men, aged 21, and poorer men, no property restrictions, could vote. The balance of power was shifting as more new states joined the Union. 5 states had been added just during Monroe's years in office. Fearing an exodus of their people, older eastern states changed their laws and followed suit. This change meant that the electorate was suddenly larger, younger, and less educated than it had been. As such, voters were less thoughtful. The electorate was more open to being moved to vote by shallow tactics like mass rallies, emotional appeals, the candidates' personal images, meetings where free food and liquor made people happy, and so forth. Contemporaries complained that the political issues of the day no longer mattered. Elections had been reduced to mere popularity contests. For better or for worse, democracy was changing America in favor of rough-and-ready men like Jackson. Once Jackson took office, he implemented what was called the spoils system. This was a practice of openly rewarding supporters and friends with positions in the government. Jackson wasn't the first leader to practice a spoils system, which had long been in place at the state level. And although Jackson only removed 252 of 612 presidential appointees, his was a more sweeping and sudden rearrangement than that of any of his predecessors. He was unapologetic. He saw it as a positive reform that prevented the development of a group of professional, lifelong bureaucrats who owed favors to one another and were tempted towards backroom dealing. Last week we discussed the Tariff of Abominations that Jackson helped to pass during the administration of John Quincy Adams. It was still in effect when Jackson took office, and it was still very unpopular. Even though South Carolina's John Calhoun had been John Quincy Adams's vice president, Calhoun publicly opposed the bill and urged his state to declare it unconstitutional and ignore it. Jackson got Calhoun to switch parties and run as his vice president, beating John Quincy Adams by the largest vote margin in the 19th century. But Calhoun continued to oppose the tariff abominations under his new boss. Things got very tense for a while. When Jackson attended a memorial birthday party for then-deceased Thomas Jefferson, he shattered Southern hopes when he proposed a toast by saying, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Calhoun immediately responded, "The Union, next to our liberty, most dear." Jackson's toast made it clear he would not support the South in their struggles with the federal government. They couldn't look to him to repeal the tariff. 2 years after that birthday party, Congress passed another tariff act in 1832. South Carolina then declared that act and the previous tariff null and void. The state threatened to secede if the federal government tried to collect the duties. 2 weeks later, Jackson ordered troops and warships to head for Charleston. Vice President Calhoun resigned his post and took a lesser position as senator during this standoff. Jackson pushed Congress to pass a force bill, which authorized him to collect taxes by force. The situation was diffused by Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky, who passed another bill that reduced all tariffs for 10 years. South Carolina agreed to comply with Clay's bill, so armed conflict was avoided. The near miss was disturbing, however. Jackson's rapid resort to force made Southerners think the federal government might use its power to make slavery illegal. The seeds of sectionalism began to sprout in increasing numbers. Their full flower would bring the Civil War. President Jackson insisted on federal power when South Carolina refused to pay its taxes, but he refused to act when Georgia violated a federal treaty and ignored the Supreme Court. Andrew Jackson, the old Indian fighter, refused to fight for the Indians when it was time to protect them. There were 5 tribes that had made treaties with the federal government, which still lived on lands in the South. The Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians had done everything the white man wanted them to do to live in peace with their new neighbors. They were known as the 5 civilized tribes. The Cherokee Indians developed their own alphabet, thanks to the imagination and hard work of a native named Sequoyah. Sequoyah was a crippled Cherokee who moved from his home, which may have been in Tennessee, and became a silversmith in Alabama. Sequoyah and the other Cherokee were fascinated by European writing. They called written language talking leaves. Around 1809, Sequoyah started work at writing the Cherokee language. At first, he tried to come up with characters for each word, but that was too complicated. He then decided to create a character for each syllable instead. That took a lot of characters. He used up all the letters we normally use in English and the Roman alphabet and kept going. After 12 years, he completed his system of writing. It took 86 different characters to spell out the Cherokee language, and it was used to print a Cherokee newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix from 1828 until 1834, until the state of Georgia banned it. You see, in 1828, the state of Georgia passed laws that gave the Cherokee Indians no legal protection against the state's seizure of their lands. The Cherokee, however, protested that their land had been protected under a federal treaty with their sovereign nation and that the state could not nullify a federal agreement. The Cherokee took their case to the Supreme Court in 1832. In the Worcester v. Georgia decision, the Supreme Court vindicated the Indians, ruling that the state of Georgia had no right to take Indian lands. Students in the government track will study this case later in this unit. While the Cherokee were still challenging Georgia's new law, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. It called for the forced removal of several tribes, which occurred during Jackson's presidency and that of his successor, Martin Van Buren. Grammar students will study the Cherokee's walk on the Trail of Tears in more detail in Week 15. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling in 1832, Jackson carried out the Indian Removal Act. He refused to execute Supreme Court Justice Marshall's decision and instead forced the Indians to move west. Unlike his response to the nullification crisis involving South Carolina, where he called out federal troops, Jackson claimed that he had no power to oppose the exercise of sovereignty of any state over all who may be within its limits. He supposedly said of John Marshall's ruling in the Worcester v. Georgia case, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." This decision would lead to one of the most shameful events in American history, the defrauding of thousands of Indians of their homes, followed by their tragic journey west on the Trail of Tears. That's a somber note to end with. Sin clouds everything that humans do, and Andrew Jackson was a larger-than-life kind of man. All in all, though, the years when Andrew Jackson was president were filled with action and adventure. New lands in the West were explored and settled at ever-faster rates. Unchecked speculation on canals, land, roads, and cotton led to a depression in the late 1830s. The leaders of the infant abolition movements began to organize societies, and the first American steam locomotive used for passenger service was built. Indeed, Jackson was the first president to ride a train. We'll take 2 weeks to look at the 2 administrations of this influential president. Enjoy getting started on Jackson this week.